On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, the war in the Pacific came to its formal end aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The Japanese delegation stood before the surrender table. The cameras were ready, the documents were waiting, and among the American officers watching the ceremony was Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the man who had spent nearly 4 years directing the American war across the Pacific. But the most remarkable part of Nimitz's story that day did not happen in front of the cameras. It happened nearby, in the quiet aftermath of a war that had left much of Japan exhausted and broken. There, at Yokosuka, stood an old battleship. She had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She had fought in one of the most consequential naval battles in modern history, and now she was rusting in concrete, stripped of equipment, surrounded by the occupying forces of the nation that had defeated her. Some wanted her dismantled, some wanted her forgotten, and some wanted her reduced to scrap. But Nimitz looked at the old ship differently. The reason went back 40 years to a garden in Tokyo when he had been a young American naval officer and had briefly met the Japanese admiral who had commanded her. That meeting had stayed with him for the rest of his life, and on the day Japan surrendered, Nimitz made a decision that helped ensure that the old battleship would survive. If you enjoy quiet journeys through history like this, you're welcome to subscribe. Now, let us go back to the beginning.
The afternoon of September 2, 1945 was very different from the images that would soon fill American newspapers. The formal surrender ceremony was over. The cameras had captured the moment. The signatures had been placed on the documents. The Japanese delegation had departed the Missouri. But across the bay, the remnants of another era were still standing. At Yokosuka, the great Japanese naval base, the occupation had already begun. The war had transformed the harbor. Ships that once represented Japanese power were damaged, abandoned, or being stripped apart. And among them was the Mikasa. She did not look like a victorious warship anymore. Her upper works had been stripped, her paint had deteriorated, parts of her equipment were disappearing. American servicemen had taken souvenirs from the ship, and without protection, the process could have continued until very little remained. Yet, the Mikasa was not an ordinary ship. She was a surviving piece of a much older Japan, a Japan that entered the 20th century determined to become a modern naval power. And on her bridge, 4 decades earlier, stood the man Nimitz admired since he was a young officer. His name was Admiral Heihachiro Togo. To understand why Nimitz cared about the ship, we have to go back to the summer of 1905. In 1905, Chester Nimitz was only 20 years old. He had recently graduated from the United States Naval Academy and was serving aboard the USS Ohio in the Pacific. He was still at the beginning of his naval career. The world around him, however, was changing rapidly. The Russo-Japanese War had placed Japan at the center of international attention. For centuries, European powers had dominated the world's military and political order. Now, an Asian nation had defeated one of Europe's great empires, and the decisive moment had come at sea. In May 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet had traveled thousands of miles from Europe toward East Asia. The journey had taken months. The fleet was exhausted. Its crews were far from home, and waiting for them was Togo's Japanese fleet.
Togo understood what the Russians were trying to do. They needed to reach Vladivostok. The most direct route took them through the waters between Korea and Japan. Togo positioned his fleet. On May 27, 1905, the Russian fleet appeared. The Japanese ships moved into position. The Japanese commander famously crossed the Russian fleet's course, concentrating his fire against the enemy formation. The battle became a disaster for Russia. Within 2 days, much of the Russian force had been destroyed, captured, scattered, or interned. The victory at Tsushima transformed Japan's position in the world, and the man commanding the Japanese fleet became an international naval hero. A few months later, young Chester Nimitz found himself in Tokyo. He attended a garden party connected with the Japanese victory. There, among Japanese officials and foreign naval officers, he saw Togo. The young American officer had a brief and cordial encounter with the famous admiral. It was not a battle. It was not a grand diplomatic meeting. There was no reason for anyone to believe that the moment would matter 40 years later. But it did. Nimitz remembered Togo, and decades afterward, the American admiral would still speak of his admiration for the Japanese commander. There was another part of Togo's story that mattered. Not what he did during the battle, what he did afterward. One of the most respected stories associated with the aftermath of Tsushima concerns the Russian commander, Admiral Zinovy Rozhestevsky. The Russian admiral had been badly wounded and captured. Togo visited him. The two men were enemies. One had defeated the other. But Togo did not treat defeat as humiliation. He treated it as something that could happen to any professional soldier. The lesson was simple. Victory did not require cruelty. For a young naval officer like Nimitz, that distinction was important. Nimitz would eventually become one of the most formidable commanders of the 20th century, but he also belonged to a generation of professional officers who studied naval history carefully. They studied battles, they studied commanders, and they studied what happened when the fighting stopped. Togo became one of the commanders Nimitz admired. The admiration did not mean Nimitz approved of everything Japan would later do. It did not mean he was sympathetic to Japanese militarism. It meant that he recognized professional excellence in an opponent. That distinction would become very important 40 years later. Togo died in 1934. By then, Chester Nimitz was no longer a young midshipman. He was an experienced American naval officer. And when Togo died, Nimitz was in Japan and attended ceremonies honoring the admiral. The connection between the two men had survived nearly 30 decades. Nimitz had watched Togo as a young officer. He had studied the battle at Tsushima. He had watched how Togo conducted himself after victory, and he never completely forgot the impression. Then, history changed. Japan and the United States went from diplomatic partners to enemies. The Pacific War began. And the young American who once met Togo in a Tokyo garden became the commander responsible for defeating the Japanese naval forces that Togo's generation had helped build. By the end of the war, Nimitz had directed campaigns across an ocean: Guadalcanal, Midway, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The American advance had pushed the Japanese empire steadily backward. The Japanese merchant fleet had been devastated. Oil supplies had been cut. Ships had been sunk. Thousands of Japanese sailors had died. Nimitz was not a sentimental commander. He had a war to win, and he pursued that war relentlessly. But defeating an enemy did not necessarily mean destroying every piece of its history. That was the distinction Nimitz would make at Yokosuka. The Mikasa was built in Britain because Japan was still developing its own capacity for constructing battleships of this type. It was launched in 1900 and commissioned into the Japanese Navy in 1902. 3 years later, she became the flagship of Togo's fleet at Tsushima. Then, strangely, the ship's combat career was almost over. Later in 1905, while in port at Sasebo, the Mikasa suffered a catastrophic ammunition explosion. Hundreds of sailors died. The ship sunk. But the Japanese raised her and repaired her. She returned to service. She later participated in operations during the First World War and the Russian Civil War period. Then came the Washington Naval Treaty. The great battleships of the previous generation were becoming symbols of a naval arms race that governments were trying to restrain. The Mikasa was decommissioned. But Japan chose not to destroy her. Instead, she became a memorial. Her hull was preserved at Yokosuka. Concrete was placed around her. She became a museum and monument to the Japanese naval victory at Tsushima. In 1926, the future Emperor Hirohito attended a ceremony connected with the ship's preservation. The Mikasa had ceased to be a weapon. She had become a memory. And then the Second World War arrived. For years, she remained at Yokosuka while the Japanese Navy expanded into one of the most powerful fleets in the world. The irony was difficult to miss. The old ship from 1905 was sitting quietly in the harbor while a new generation of Japanese sailors prepared for another war. It watched the Japanese Navy rise, and eventually it watched it fall. By August 1945, Japan was defeated. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had devastated 2 cities. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan. Japanese forces across Asia and the Pacific were surrendering, and on September 2, the formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri. Nimitz was there. He signed it as the representative of the United States, but the ceremony belonged to MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers. MacArthur stood at the center of the ceremony. The photographers surrounded him. The Japanese representatives signed. The Allied representatives followed. Nimitz's signature was one of the most important on the document, but he did not try to dominate the moment. He signed and stepped away. For Nimitz, the ceremony was not the end of responsibility. It was simply the end of one kind of responsibility. And that same day, his attention turned towards something much smaller than the surrender ceremony, the Mikasa. When Nimitz saw the condition of the old ship, he was disturbed. The ship was being stripped.
Her history was disappearing piece by piece, so he intervened. A guard was placed aboard. The looting was stopped. The old flagship would remain. The decision was significant, but it was not a declaration that Japan should be forgiven. Nimitz was not suddenly defending Japanese militarism. He was preserving a historical object. And there was another reason. The Soviet Union had its own memory of Tsushima. For Russia, the battle had been a national humiliation. The destruction of the Baltic Fleet had become one of the most painful episodes in Russian naval history. The Soviets, therefore, had little affection for the Mikasa. There was pressure to eliminate the ship, but Nimitz resisted its destruction. He could see something the politics of the occupation sometimes obscured. The Mikasa was no longer an enemy warship. She was history. And history, once destroyed, could not easily be recovered. The war ended. Nimitz returned to the United States. In December 1945, he became Chief of Naval Operations. It was a very different job from commanding the Pacific Fleet. During the war, decisions were immediate. Ships moved, aircraft flew, submarines hunted, Marines landed. Reports arrived from the front. In Washington, the battles were fought with budgets, hearings,
reorganizations, and competing visions for the future of the military. The American military had to shrink. The enormous wartime navy could not remain at wartime strength. Ships were decommissioned. Personnel numbers dropped dramatically. The National Security Act of 1947 created a new structure for American national defense and established the United States Air Force as an independent service. Nimitz had to navigate all of it. He stayed for 2 years. Then, on December 15, 1947, he left the office. He did not spend the rest of his life trying to remain in the center of American politics. He retired. He returned to California. His home became quieter. The war gradually moved into the past. But in Japan, another battle was beginning. It was a battle over memory. The Mikasa had survived the war, but survival was not the same as preservation. The ship deteriorated. Her upper works had been removed. The area around her was used for entertainment. At various times, parts of the old ship were sold or stripped. The monument that had once represented Japan's greatest naval victory was becoming an abandoned relic. Then, in the 1950s, Japanese preservationists began trying to save her. They needed money, they needed political support, and they needed someone's name could bridge the enormous distance between Japan of 1905 and the United States of the post-war era. They thought of Nimitz. He was no longer in command. He was no longer responsible for Japan. He had no official reason to become involved, but he had never forgotten Togo, and he had never forgotten the Mikasa. Nimitz supported the preservation effort. He contributed to the cause, including proceeds connected with an article he wrote about the importance of preserving the historic ship. His involvement mattered for another reason. His name carried enormous weight. He had been the American commander who directed the Pacific War. He had signed the Japanese surrender document, and now he was publicly supporting the preservation of Togo's flagship. That changed the conversation. American naval personnel and others also contributed. Japanese supporters raised funds. The Japanese government became involved, and gradually, the possibility of restoring the Mikasa became real. Restoration began in earnest in the late 1950s. The work was extensive. The ship had spent years exposed to salt air. Her structure had deteriorated. Her original equipment had been lost or removed. Much of what visitors would eventually see had to be reconstructed or replaced. But the goal was not to return the Mikasa to combat. It was to return her to memory. On May 27, 1961, the anniversary of the Battle of Tsushima, the restored Mikasa reopened to the public. The old flagship was alive again, not as a battleship, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a museum, a physical reminder of an earlier age. And somewhere behind that restoration was the influence of an American admiral who had once been the enemy commander responsible for defeating Japan's wartime navy. Nimitz himself did not attend the ceremony, but his contribution remained part of the story. The ship survived, and that survival created a strange historical bridge. Togo had defeated Russia at Tsushima. Nimitz had defeated Japan's wartime navy, and decades later, Nimitz helped preserve Togo's ship. History had turned enemies into custodians of one another's memories. The story might have ended there, but it did not. Nimitz died on February 20, 1966, at the age of 80. He had spent his final years quietly in California. He had commanded one of the largest naval forces ever assembled. He had helped win the Pacific War. He had served as Chief of Naval Operations. And yet, after retirement, he largely avoided turning his life into a monument to himself. His connection with Togo, however, continued through the people who remembered it. In Fredericksburg, Texas, Nimitz's hometown, a museum dedicated to his life and the Pacific War was taking shape. The old Nimitz Hotel, associated with his family, became part of what would eventually become the National Museum of the Pacific War. Then came an extraordinary gesture. In 1976, the people of Japan gave the United States a Japanese Garden of Peace in Fredericksburg. The garden was designed to honor the connection between Togo and Nimitz. Japanese craftsmen helped construct it. Its design included a replica of Togo's study. The garden was not a celebration of war, it was a symbol of reconciliation. A place where visitors could stand quietly and remember that the men who once commanded opposing fleets belonged to the same profession, understood the same sea, and both had lived through a world that disappeared during their lifetimes. The garden was dedicated in May 1976. Nimitz had been dead for 10 years. He never saw it. But perhaps there was something fitting about that. He never seemed particularly interested in monuments to himself. The garden wasn't really about him alone. It was about what could happen after the fighting ended.
It is tempting to tell this story as though Nimitz suddenly became a gentleman after the war. That would be misleading. Nimitz had commanded a brutal campaign. He had overseen operations that caused enormous Japanese military and civilian losses. American submarines had strangled Japanese shipping. American aircraft had devastated Japanese cities. American forces had fought across islands where casualties were measured in thousands. Nimitz never forgot that war, nor should we. The preservation of the Mikasa did not erase any of it. It did not mean Nimitz believed the war had been unnecessary. It did not mean he excused Japanese aggression. It meant something narrower. He believed that an enemy could be defeated without every part of its history being destroyed. That is an important distinction. The Mikasa represented the Japan of Togo's generation, the Japan that had fought Russia, the Japan that had entered the modern naval world, the Japan that had produced one of the most famous naval victories of the early 20th century. That was not the same thing as preserving the militarism that eventually led Japan into war with the United States. Nimitz could separate the two. Perhaps his long experience as a professional naval officer allowed him to do that. He could look at a ship and see more than an enemy flag. He could see history. He could see craftsmanship. He could see the career of a commander he had admired since he was 20. And he could understand that one day the war would become history too. Today, the Mikasa still rests at Yokosuka. The ship is no longer capable of fighting. Her guns are museum pieces. Her decks are historical spaces. Her concrete berth is a reminder of how completely the world has changed. And nearby stands one of the most important American naval bases in the Pacific. That geography carries its own meaning. The nation that once fought Japan across the Pacific now maintains a close military partnership with Japan. The two countries that once destroyed one another's ships now cooperate at sea. And the old Mikasa remains as a physical reminder of a world that no longer exists. In Fredericksburg, Texas, the Japanese Garden of Peace tells the same story from another direction. There is water, there are stones, there are carefully arranged plants, and there is the replica of Togo's study.
It is difficult to imagine a more unexpected place for such a memorial, a Japanese garden in the Texas Hill Country, built partly through Japanese support, dedicated to the memory of a Japanese admiral and an American admiral. Two men whose careers began in completely different countries and ended up connected by a war that neither of them could have imagined when they first met. There is one final detail worth remembering about Nimitz. He did not seem to need the spotlight. At the surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri, he signed his name and stepped back. He did not turn the moment into a personal performance. When he left the Navy, he did not spend the rest of his life trying to keep himself at the center of public attention. And when the opportunity came to help preserve the Mikasa, he did not make the story about himself. He simply helped. Perhaps that is why the story survived. Because the important part was never Nimitz standing beside the ship. It was the ship remaining after he was gone. It was the Japanese sailors and preservationists who rebuilt it. It was the American veterans who helped. It was the Japanese craftsmen who traveled across the Pacific to build a garden in Texas. And the quiet transformation of two former enemies into allies. The story began with a young American midshipman standing in a Tokyo garden in 1905. He watched an aging Japanese admiral speak and laugh with foreign officers. He could not have known what that brief meeting would mean. He could not have known that the admiral's flagship would one day be threatened with destruction. He could not have known that he himself would command the American Pacific Fleet during the greatest naval war in history. And he certainly could not have known that 40 years later, he would stand near that old ship after defeating the country it represented. But history sometimes works that way. A moment that seems insignificant at 20 can still be waiting for you at 60. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, the war ended on paper. But history does not end when the signatures are placed on a document. It continues in the buildings that survive, in the ships that remain, in the photographs, in the gardens, and sometimes in the decisions made quietly after everyone else has gone home. Nimitz had spent 4 years helping destroy the Japanese military machine, but when the war was finished, he did not believe that everything connected to his former enemy needed to disappear. He saw the Mikasa, he remembered Togo, and he chose preservation. Years later, Japanese people helped create a garden of peace in the town where Nimitz had grown up. The symbolism was almost too perfect. A Japanese admiral remembered in an American town. An American admiral remembered aboard a Japanese memorial ship. And between them, a war that once seemed impossible to survive. The men who fought that war are almost all gone now. The ships are museums, the battlefields are quiet, the uniforms hang behind glass, and the Pacific, which once carried fleets toward one another, continues to move beneath the same sky. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of Nimitz and the Mikasa. Victory does not always have to end in destruction. Sometimes, when the fighting is finally over, the most meaningful thing a victorious commander can do is decide what should be allowed to remain. And somewhere in Yokosuka, an old battleship still rests in concrete. She is no longer an enemy. She is no longer a weapon. She is a memory. And because one American admiral chose to protect that memory, the bridge where Togo once stood is still there to be seen. If you'd like to return for another quiet journey through history, you're always welcome here. Good night.